Hello Year 8 and welcome to Lesson 5 on The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe. And today we are going to be reading chapters 5 and 6, but also the lesson objective is to identify and comment on the use of symbols. So start off by having a look at the 6 symbols that are displayed on this page here. And use your worksheet to jot down what you think each of those symbols represents or stands for. And as a challenge, you could also attempt to try to define what the words symbol and symbolism mean, especially when you think about how we use that word when we're talking about novels and plays and books. So, a symbol is a thing that represents or stands for something else, especially a material object, a real solid thing, representing something abstract, something that's more of an idea or a concept. So, for example, one of the symbols on your sheet was the dove. So that is a real physical object, but it's standing for the abstract or non-physical idea of peace, isn't it? So in literature, symbolism refers to using specific symbols to help represent something else, whether it's an idea or a quality. Through this literary element, the different symbols allow readers to better understand and interpret a piece of work. So later on in your English lessons, when you get to year 10 or 11, for GCSE, you'll be reading a book called The Lord of the Flies, and symbolism is really important in that novel. One of the symbols is the fact that the boys that are shipwrecked on the desert island begin to paint their faces, and that's symbolic of their move away from civilized human behaviour to much more kind of savage and violent human behaviour. So we can start using the word symbolic to think about our predictions for the character of Edmund. When Lucy and Edmund return to the real world, Edmund decides to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. What do you think that might be? What's the worst thing that he could possibly do to his sister now they've both come back from Narnia? And you could start thinking about how that is symbolic of the way that Edmund's character is beginning to change and develop. And that's what we're going to be looking at later on. And now it's time for you to read chapters 5 and 6 of the novel. And once again, you can read these to yourself using the online version, or you can combine the two things and listen to the audiobook whilst you're reading. You will be picking out short quotes today, so it's really important that if you want to use the audiobook, you do have the online version open in front of you as well, okay? Because you're working with the text and a lot of the lessons are to do with selecting the correct evidence. So I've put the timings on the slide for you so that you can find that chapter 5 starts at 53 minutes. So having read chapters 5 and 6 then, we're going to zoom in on a very small detail in the novel, but something that's quite important. It's the robin. And we're going to be asking ourselves the question, how and why is the robin used symbolically in The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe, and another children's adventure story called The Secret Garden? And if you're interested in pursuing The Secret Garden further, there was a very, very good film version of it made last year that's available on Amazon Prime, possibly Netflix as well. And it's a great book as well. So dig out the book. It'll be free online somewhere if you just type in Read The Secret Garden. It's a lovely book. Okay, so the extracts I'm about to read are also attached in the resources for this lesson, so you'll be able to refer back to the copies. And what we're looking for is the way that the robin appears in both texts, but appears in a very similar way. And that immediately tells us that there must be a deeper meaning to the robin. If two different writers are using the robin in sort of a similar way, and the books were written about 40 years apart from each other, there must be something symbolic about the robin. So here's the extract from The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe. They were all still wondering what to do next when Lucy said, "Look, there's a robin with such a red breast. It's the first bird I've seen here. I say, I wonder if birds can talk in Narnia. It almost looks as if it wanted to tell us something." Then she turned to the robin and said, "Please, could you tell us where Tumnus the fawn has been taken to?" As she said this, she took a step towards the bird. It at once flew away, but only as far as to the next tree. There it perched and looked at them very hard, as if it understood all that they were saying. Almost without noticing that they had done so, the 4 children went a step or 2 nearer to it. At this, the robin flew away again to the next tree and once more looked at them very hard. You couldn't have found a robin with a redder chest or a brighter eye. "Do you know," said Lucy, "I really believe he means us to follow him." "I've had an idea he does," said Susan. "What do you think, Peter?" "Well, we might as well try it," answered Peter. The robin appeared to understand the matter thoroughly. It kept going from tree to tree, always a few yards ahead of them, but always so near that they could easily follow it. In this way it led them on slightly downhill. Wherever the robin alighted, a little shower of snow would fall off the branch. Presently the clouds parted overhead, and the winter sun came out, and the snow all around them grew dazzlingly bright. "We're following a guide we know nothing about. How do we know which side it's on? Why shouldn't it be leading us into a trap?" said Edmund. "Well, that's a nasty idea. Still, a robin, you know, they're good birds. In all the stories I've ever read, I'm sure a robin wouldn't be on the wrong side," Peter replied. Okay, and then in the secret garden, Mary skipped round all the gardens and round the orchard, resting every few minutes. She stopped with a little laugh of pleasure, and there, lo and behold, was the robin swaying on a long branch of ivy. He had followed her and greeted her with a chirp. As Mary had skipped towards him, she felt something heavy in her pocket strike against her at each jump, and when she saw the robin she laughed again. "You showed me where the key was yesterday," she said. "You ought to show me the door today, but I don't believe you know." The robin flew from his swinging spray of ivy on to the top of the wall, and he opened his beak and sang a loud, lovely trill merely to show off. Mary had stepped close to the robin, and suddenly the gust of wind swung aside some loose ivy trees, and more suddenly still she jumped towards it and caught it in her hand. This she did because she'd seen something under it, a round knob which had been covered by the leaves hanging over it. It was the knob of a door. The robin kept singing and twittering away and tilting its head to one side as if he were excited as she was. What was this under her hand, which was square and made of iron, and which her fingers found a hole in? It was the lock of the door, which had been closed for 10 years, and she put her hand in her pocket, drew out the key, and found it fitted the keyhole. She put the key in and turned it. It took 2 hands to do it, but it did turn. She held back the swinging curtain of ivy and pushed back the door, which opened slowly, slowly. Then she slipped in through, shut it behind her, and stood with her back against it, looking about her and breathing quite fast with excitement, wonder, and delight. She was standing in the secret garden. So just returning to what Peter says in Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe, in all the stories I've ever read, I'm sure the robin wouldn't be on the wrong side. They're good birds. So we're going to be exploring this feature of the robin in a little bit more detail. So using your worksheet, go to task 2 now, and what I would like you to do is to find 3 similarities between the way the robin is presented in each text, and you could focus on how it's described, how it behaves, the way the characters react to the robin, and what the robin does in the story. So use the table to put the similarities side by side and jot down your ideas. Okay, and you might have noticed the following similarities. There is a communication between the robin and the children in both stories. Both sets of children talk to the robin, and the robin seems to respond in some ways. So we've got Lucy asking the robin, "Please, can you tell us where Tumnus the fawn has been taken to?" And we've got Mary in the secret garden almost teasing the robin, saying, "You showed me where the key was yesterday, you ought to show me the door today, but I don't believe you know." It's almost like offering the robin a little bit of a challenge, isn't it? In The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe, the robin seems to reply by looking at it and trying to communicate with the children that way. There it perched and looked at them very hard, as if it understood. Whereas the robin in Secret Garden seems to actually use its song to communicate with the children. The robin kept singing and twittering away and tilting its head. And both of the robins lead the children in the direction of where they need to go to. Mary is able to find a lock and the key to the secret garden, because the robin's shown her. And although you haven't got the whole text here, the robin does lead them, not to Mr. Tumnus, unfortunately, but to the answer to the problem of where Mr. Tumnus is. So, like I said, the books were written 40 years apart. The Secret Garden was written in 1911 and The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe was written in 1950. So we've got 39 years apart, and yet they're using the robin in exactly the same way. Now, is that because C.S. Lewis read The Secret Garden and thought, well, that's a good idea, I'll nick that idea off Francis Hodgson Burnett, I think is the writer? Or is there something more symbolic about the robin? Are both writers sort of presuming that the reader will understand the symbolism of the robin? Remember, also, Peter says in all the stories I've read, as if it's a common feature of books that he's read. So where might the symbolism come from, which these writers are presuming the reader will recognise and understand? And what other books, texts and stories were widely known by English readers, especially 50 to 100 years ago? So what is the book that writers, especially in the last century, could sort of presume everybody had read and everybody knew? Okay, and hopefully you would have thought, the Bible, okay, because generally speaking, the majority of the population would go to church, or would, the Bible, most houses would have and conduct some sort of reading from the Bible every Sunday. That was very common practice up until about 50 years ago. So, and the Bible is rich with imagery and metaphor, and so writers often use biblical imagery, and especially when you get to GCSE and the texts get more complex, biblical imagery is something that you'll frequently talk about when you're studying your literature texts. So just to think about these questions then, what season or festival is the robin associated with? Obviously Christmas. What is the true meaning of Christmas, which beliefs are linked to? And obviously, it's not about the present, it's the birth of Christ. And then if we fast forward a little bit on Christ's life, the robin becomes linked to Christ at the moment of his crucifixion. Okay, so can you start thinking about what it might be in terms of the physical appearance of the robin that might link to the story of Jesus's crucifixion? Okay, and the link is obviously the red breast. That is the most distinctive feature of the robin. And although this story doesn't actually appear in the Bible, it's part of this culture of stories that surround the Bible. And the story is that when Jesus was on the cross being crucified, he was forced to wear a crown of thorns that dug into his flesh and made his face bleed, and obviously caused him lots of discomfort and pain. And the robin came along and picked the thorns out of his flesh in order to try and comfort him and ease his pain a little bit. The robin got some of the blood on its breast, and since then it's sort of worn it with pride, if you like, as a symbol of being helpful. And lots of gardeners will report that when they're out gardening, robins will come along and kind of sit on their spades and keep them company. And they're really, for tiny little birds, they're really quite plucky and brave, but also very, very solitary. It says here the robin is a solitary, strong, silent guardian. Even when looking after its family, it's rare for it to flock with others, preferring to be solitary and heard when it speaks. The beautiful bird is part of the dawn chorus, singing in the new day, and is a gentle reminder of the chance for new beginnings and hope. So it's been a very symbolic animal throughout the history of literature. So if C.S. Lewis is using biblical symbolism in his story, which other really famous Bible stories or events in the Bible or characters from the Bible do you think he might go on to continue to use? And in later lessons, and at the end of this lesson, we'll have a look at that in a bit more detail. So your final task today is to have a go at doing a piece of writing about symbolism, and also using that really important comparison skill that you need to start developing. So we've got the task: write a paragraph to explain the way the robin is used in a similar symbolic way in both texts. The challenge is to bring in that biblical knowledge that you've just gained, the history of the symbolism, and try and explain why it is that Lewis and Hodgson Burnett have used the robin in a similar way. So I've given you a writing frame, so all you need to do is when you hit the ... the ellipsis, you can finish the sentence off. There are many similarities in the way the two writers use the robin symbolically in their novels. One of the most interesting is that both robins, okay, and you can go back to those 3 examples that we talked about earlier in the video. And then we want to bring our evidence in. So try and find a little quote from each text to prove that both texts are doing that thing. And remember, if you need to look at the text, it's included in the resources for this lesson. For example, in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis writes, blah, 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 blah. And this is very similar to The Secret Garden, where F.H. Burnett writes, blah, 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 blah. And then you want to explain why those things are similar. These descriptions are very similar because, so in your own words, try and explain why the robin's doing the same thing in both texts. And as a challenge, the reason why both writers are using the robin as a symbol in their novels is because, and in your own words again, can you explain where these ideas come from, what the robin represents, and how that's linked to that biblical story? So make sure that you've completed all the tasks on your worksheet and that you've sent that back to your teacher via the Google Classroom. But let's just finish off the lesson. I said that there might be other biblical imagery in the text. And in this section that we've read so far, we've come across the Queen giving Edmund Turkish delight and Edmund wanting more and more and more Turkish delight. So can you think of a way that that might also be linked to stories from the Bible? Okay, so you might have been thinking along the lines of the fact that greed and avarice is one of the 7 deadly sins, wanting lots of things that cause us pleasure as a deadly sin. And also, if you think about the way that the Turkish delight is being used, it's being used to trap and tempt Edmund, isn't it? By giving him this Turkish delight, the Queen is getting him to reveal lots of secrets about his brothers and sisters, and eventually that leads to some quite serious actions on Edmund's part. So you might remember the Lord's Prayer. It says, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." And it's the temptation of this Turkish delight that means that he goes down this evil path. So C.S. Lewis was a devout Christian and believed and deliberately used the novel to reflect his strong personal beliefs. Whether you share these beliefs or not, it's really important to be able to recognise the patterns in literature, the references to other books and stories where writers are using symbolism to strengthen your understanding and enjoyment of the text. In all of the books you will study at GCSE, there will be some form of reference to the Bible, and it's the most recognised and shared text in our culture. So in Jekyll and Hyde, in Lord of the Flies, in Romeo and Juliet, you need to build your confidence in being able to refer to the use of symbolism, and in particular biblical symbolism. Okay, that's it for today then, and I'll see you in the next lesson.